Great, thanks for coming to my talk, at least virtually anyways. This is money for nothing, shelves for free, low budget IoT hacking. So a little bit about me. My name is Chris Hernandez. I'm a security consultant, so I do things like red teaming, pen testing, and lately I've been spending time in the purple teaming space, really just trying to get defenders as much value out of offensive work as possible. I'm founder of the Adversary Academy, security training company. I do security research, and I like finding vulnerabilities and popping shells, as do most people probably who've tuned into this. And then when I'm not at my computer, I try to be as analog as possible. So try my hand at farming. I live pretty remotely, and don't play any online games. I've got a Game Boy and stuff like that. So yeah, I just try to live an analog life, just because I know how insecure some things can be. So inspiration for the talk. This is kind of the humorous take on it. It's like, what if Ryan Lewis and Macklemore wanted to get into hacking, right? So somebody has, let's say, only $20 to start doing security research. More seriously, it's sort of stemmed from, I've seen a lot of conversations in social media around individuals trying to get into security, not being able to do it because they don't have any demonstrated experience. And it's sort of one of those like chicken and egg problems, right? Like you can't get experience till you get a job, and you can't get a job until you get experience. Sometimes doing security research it's usually always expensive from a time perspective, but it can also be expensive from a hardware perspective, especially if you're getting into if you're trying to target newer embedded systems and things like that. Some of your gear can be pretty expensive, but how can we do it for only $20? I try to be fairly both environmentally conscious and thrifty. So I do shop at Goodwill and low cost stores and things like that. I always see old hardware in in sort of the electronics bins, and I just needed an excuse to buy some of that stuff and see what it was running. So first target, it was $5.10. You can see here it was not tested by whoever I bought this from. So Linksys E1200 version 2, and just crack it open, and right away we can see a few chips. Even if you don't necessarily know a lot about embedded systems, there are some things that look maybe interesting, and then as you get more familiar with all these systems, you'll see some common and repeating patterns. But anyways, looks like we can see a memory chip, maybe some kind of a CPU or a system on a chip, some blank pins, and a few other small chips. And in this case, really it's Google to the rescue. So since this is low budget, I didn't use a fancy camera or anything like that. These pictures are just taken from my iPhone. So start Googling the components, and we can see here that this is serial flash. Looks like we'd be able to connect to a few of the pins that are documented to dump the contents of flash memory. Other Googling lets us know that this is indeed the RAM chip for the board. Not a lot we can do with that, but it's good to know, sort of where everything is laid out on the board. And then, doing some Googling on this, we, learned that it is a Broadcom system on a chip. Get some additional information on it. For this particular chip, maybe it's the specific version, or it might also be that it was pretty old. I think this or the other system was from 2014. So it's also possible that Broadcom just isn't hosting the spec sheets for these devices anymore. It doesn't really matter, because in this case, it's a BGA or ball grid array system on a chip. So all of the pins that we might be able to get access to are actually on the underside of the of the chip. So for low cost research perspective, it's not necessarily a good target for us. Googling also reveals what is probably the original version of this board. You can see it does have a COM port actually soldered onto the board. On mine it was removed, but it's easy enough to remedy. So it's interesting, sort of like embedded system archaeology, if you realize that probably between version 1 and version 2, maybe they're a few years apart, so between 2012 and 2014, the manufacturer realized that it might be preferable for them to not have the cost of soldering the COM port pins onto the board, and I guess make it slightly more secure. Probably then it was only a cost saving measure. So cool, let's get a shell as fast as possible, right? I booted up this system and it was running version 2.0.0.6, only a few versions out of date. So I downloaded the most modern version of the firmware, which I think was 2.0.0.9. And Binwalk yielded some strange or some unusual results. But it doesn't really matter. I didn't want to spend a lot of time trying to, dump out the contents of the firmware if we could interact with the device other ways. So ended up connecting some pins to the UART connection there, and also logged in as an admin, with default credentials to the web interface, and started sort of just, messing around with it, playing around with it. Once we connected to the console, we were able to see all of the diagnostic output. And one thing caught my eye, which is that there's a certain binary that took the host name and passed it in as an argument to that binary, whatever CSM DNS is. I don't know, probably something to do with DNS. It takes the host name, which we actually control from the web interface. So yeah, what if our host name is some URL encoded command injection? So in this example, I'm just changing the name to touch the file pwn in the temp directory, and connecting into the device and checking that directory, we can see that it is in fact, the file is written to that directory. So awesome. How do we go from being able to write a file to a directory to reverse shell? This device was running BusyBox, so there's no Netcat wasn't included. A lot of the sort of standard Linux reverse shells weren't possible just because none of those binaries were there. But wget was included. So realize that if we have wget, we can load an arbitrary binary to the temp directory, because the temp directory was writable. But it's sort of a weird operating system, so we'd have to compile our own version of Netcat. Thankfully, the developer Linksys has open source developer tools for us, so you can download the tool chain for the E1200 version 2 and try to compile Netcat. So here we do just that, downloaded the tool chain, also downloaded the Netcat source, compiled it for as a MIPS binary with their included compiler, and came somewhat normal Netcat binary. Had wget go and download the Netcat binary that we were hosting on our web server. We can see on this third step that our web server does get a request from our router to pull the Netcat binary, and then changing the name again would execute Netcat as a listener, and then from our attacker system, we're able to connect to the um, the bind shell in this case that we set up. So cool. That was a pretty easy way to get a shell. Obviously, like the command injection vulnerability was like really beneficial in us like writing arbitrary files to the file system. We had the developer tools, right? So we were able to like write our own binaries that we wanted for the system. But what if that was just a little too hard? Maybe the next one that we find is easier. So our next device is a Belkin F9K 1009 V2. And the cool thing about this one, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, but it actually came still in the box. So the price tag on here is $5.99, and I think I got it half off because Goodwill has 50% off sales sometime. But anyways, all of the, somebody saved this thing. This thing is from 2014. Somebody saved this with the packaging and all of the manuals and all the information for almost 10 years before they decided to donate it to Goodwill. So it's cool. It's not a collector's item, but I thought that was kind of neat that somebody could be organized for that long. Anyways, we got a brand new in the box system for about $5. It is running a slightly out of date firmware, but we download the newest version of the firmware and extract it, run binwalk, and in this case we're off to the races. We don't have any weird files that come out of binwalk, so we're able to sort of navigate the entire file system that we know is also running on our device, or at least a similar version of the file system. And so this one, the pins were, the UART pins were soldered shut, or there was solder in the UART pins, versus the previous one had just an opening where I was able to just sort of plug the little DuPont wires into it. This one, I just heated up the solder again, and then plugged the pins in on the back. So it's kind of ghetto way to connect into your debug interface. So again, debug interface, we're connected to that. We're watching the debug interface to see if anything interesting is happening as we're interacting with the device via the web interface. And then we're also, doing sort of the normal stuff of do a port scan on the router, see what other services are running. Since we're interactive on the host, see what binaries are running and listening on specific arbitrary ports. As I was interacting with it, I found that there's a root account that is not tied to the admin account on the web interface, and setting the admin account password on the web interface doesn't change the root account. And Telnet is running. You can log in as root, and the password is root. And as far as I can tell, there's no way to change this, and that password was the same on the most up-to-date version of the firmware. And so that's one of the interesting sort of impacts of this is, the vendor doesn't necessarily want to spend any more time or money or resources fixing security vulnerabilities on old hardware. So in a lot of ways, because there's this planned obsolescence, you are most secure when you're running a more modern and up-to-date embedded system. I think the point at which something is sort of end of life for manufacturer support is the point at which I would one, look for vulnerabilities on it, and two, not run it in a production environment, because there's nothing you can do if it's not supported anymore. So that's all well and good, and I think as a security professional, oftentimes it's easy to sort of be a little bit jaded about new things are always coming out, but is security ever getting better? I follow the Pwn to Own events, and I know oftentimes on the embedded systems, there's still stack-based buffer overflows that they exploit, or if you're a little bit more sophisticated, like a heap-based buffer overflow, but still sort of ban functions or functions that shouldn't sort of live in those binaries or being abused to achieve code execution. So is security really getting better? For this sort of sample size of 1, I had a Netgear cable modem. It's a gigabit speed modem, still sold today. It's $200. It's actively maintained. I don't need it, so I figured I'd crack it open and take a look. So some of the interesting things about the board is that it does actually have 2 debug output ports. I think that is for one side is a Broadcom sock, and then the other side is like the whatever the CPU is for taking the cable modem signal or something like that. Anyways, there's basically like two separate computers on this, or connecting to both of the separate debug outputs. Appeared that there were 2 sort of separate systems running on this board simultaneously. The other interesting thing is there's no longer like this small like 64 meg flash. This I think is a 1 gig flash chip, and it's a 48 pin flash chip. So a reader for this, if you wanted to do a chip off read of it, would be $60. There's ways that you could read it from like a chip on read, so you're not doing destructive reading of the data on here. I'm guessing those are probably about $60 as well. Couldn't find any JTAG ports or anything like that. The other interesting thing is you could see in the logs that output is disabled after the device is booted, so you're not really going to get any information in about the runtime environment other than sort of like the initial boot up of the device. You'd have to actually read the flash and figure out where the like debug build versus non-debug build is set, if it's even possible to adjust that. So the level of difficulty on something like this is I would say like not for a beginner. I don't have the FlashCat device to read this even if I wanted to. So yeah, things have gotten significantly better. They also know to disable debug output. So over the course of 10 years, things have gotten a little bit better. So in summary, yeah, given a small sample size, we can see that embedded system security is improving at the board level, at the hardware level and software level versus what was available 10 years ago. It's significantly more cost effective to target older systems. One of the things I'd like to do is go out to like e-waste recyclers and just see if they have old boards that they're gonna break down and recycle that I could take. That would sort of drive the $10 hardware spend down to potentially zero. I did also spend $10 on DuPont wires. I had a Shikra, so that was what I used to connect to the debug interfaces, or dump the SPI flash. So all in all, pretty inexpensive hack. But again, we could probably make things cheaper. So yeah, speaking of making things cheaper, making things more affordable, that's one of the things that I'm wanting to do. So I'm reaching out to some local e-waste recyclers. I want to see if they have a large selection of, let's say somebody gets rid of like 20 of the same device or something like that. Can I get all 20 of those and then build a course around them and pass that savings on to people who want to learn about hacking embedded systems? That way they don't have to spend $20 on a device or $200 on a new device. And we're also being green and avoiding some of the supply chain issues that the world has been having lately. So that's my talk. If you have any questions, there's my Twitter handle, my Medium account, or you can just shoot me an email. Thanks very much.